Welcome to Grim Fiction, where darkness meets tranquility. Here, we weave haunting tales set to the soothing sound of rain, perfect for those who crave a touch of the eerie to drift off to sleep. Every night, immerse yourself in new stories that blend the mysterious with the calming, transforming your nights into a journey through the shadows. Subscribe now and let the rain carry you into a world of chilling tales posted daily, just for you. Bellamy Manor wasn't just a house. It was a monument to time, a building that seemed to watch the town grow and change around it while remaining utterly still. Everyone in the village had a story about it. Some swore they'd seen lights in its windows when it should have been empty. Others claimed to hear faint music, like the notes of an old music box carried on the night wind. But no one ever stayed long enough to confirm these tales. Nobody except Sarah. Sarah Walker was the kind of person who found beauty in the unlovely. She wasn't naive. She just had a relentless curiosity that sometimes overpowered her better judgment. When she arrived in the village for a semester break, she was drawn to the manor like a moth to a flame. It wasn't just the challenge that excited her, though she did enjoy a good dare. It was the mystery. What happened to the Bellamys all those years ago? Why had the townsfolk let the house rot in silence? When Sarah asked about it, the locals clammed up. An older man at the general store simply frowned. "You don't want to go messing around up there," he said, shoving her change across the counter. "Bad things happen to people who go in that house." "Like what?" Sarah asked. She couldn't help herself. He just shook his head. "Just don't." But it was too late. Once she heard the warnings, once she saw the way people refused to even glance toward the hill where the manor stood, Sarah was hooked. That evening, she grabbed her flashlight, a water bottle, and a notebook. If nothing else, she figured she could jot down a few thoughts, take some pictures, and satisfy her curiosity. How many times had she been told to stay away from something, only to find it was harmless? The old Bellamy Manor was just a house, she told herself. It couldn't really do her any harm. Could it? The walk up the hill was steeper than she expected. As the village lights faded behind her, she began to feel more alone. The air grew cooler, and the shadows stretched longer as dusk deepened into night. By the time she reached the house, her breath was coming in quick, shallow gasps, not just from the climb, but from the sight of the manor itself. It loomed against the darkening sky, its roof jagged like broken teeth. The windows were black voids, their frames warped and rotting. The front door was massive, painted a deep green that had faded and chipped away over the years. The house didn't look empty. It looked like it was waiting. Sarah took a steadying breath and pressed her hand against the iron gate. The cold metal bit into her palm. She gave it a push, and the gate swung open on rusted hinges with a screech that echoed into the trees. She stepped onto the path that led to the front door. The gravel crunched beneath her boots, each step sounding far too loud in the stillness. Something moved in the periphery of her vision, a flutter like a bird's wing, but when she turned, there was nothing there. Just the house, the path, and the suffocating silence. At the door, Sarah hesitated. Her hand hovered over the brass doorknob, tarnished but still intact. She glanced behind her, half expecting to see someone following her, though she knew no one else had dared to come this far. The village lay far below, its lights now mere pinpricks in the distance. The air felt heavy, as though the manor itself were leaning down to stare at her. She turned the knob and pushed. The door groaned open, revealing a narrow hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. Her flashlight beam flickered, the light weak against the darkness that spilled out from inside. It was colder here, colder than the night air outside. She took her first step into the old Bellamy Manor, and the door slammed shut behind her. The sound of the door slamming behind her reverberated through the narrow entryway, startling Sarah into a sharp inhale. She spun around, her flashlight darting across the heavy oak panels. But the door was just as it had been closed, unmoving. The oppressive silence settled again, wrapping around her like a thick, unseen cloak. She reminded herself that she had shut the door against the chill. She must have, but as she reached for it, the knob wouldn't turn. Locked, she frowned. Perhaps the mechanism was old and jammed, she thought. She shook it once, twice, but it remained firm in her grasp. She turned back toward the hallway, raising her flashlight higher. The light barely cut through the shadows, The darkness seemed to eat it. The beam revealed cracked walls lined with faded, peeling wallpaper. Dust motes hung in the air, swirling as she moved. A heavy silence pressed down on her, the kind that made her own footsteps sound deafeningly loud. Each creak of the wooden floorboards under her boots felt like a crack splitting through the stillness. As she ventured deeper into the hall, she became aware of how cold it was. Her breath puffed out invisible clouds. There was no wind, no draft she could feel, and yet the temperature was sinking fast, biting through her jacket. She paused to rub her arms, glancing around. The house, though decrepit, felt oddly aware, as if it were listening to her every movement. Then she heard it, a whisper, faint and indistinct. She held her breath, straining her ears. It came again, just on the edge of hearing. It wasn't clear enough to make out words, but it was unmistakably a voice. She whipped her flashlight toward the source of the sound, her heart pounding. The hallway was empty, the beam only revealing more cracked wallpaper and a framed photo hanging crookedly on the wall. She stepped closer, the whisper falling silent, as if aware of her approach. The photograph was black and white, its glass cracked and cloudy. It showed a family of 4 standing on the front steps of Bellamy Manor, their faces eerily faded. A man, a woman, a young boy, and a girl not much older than Sarah when the photo was taken. The girl's expression struck her, a slight smile that seemed to linger just a moment too long. Sarah tilted the frame, trying to get a better look. The light reflected oddly, making it seem like the girl's eyes glinted for a second. Her stomach turned, and she quickly stepped back. She continued forward, her flashlight beam flickering again. The house creaked and groaned as if shifting under her weight. The walls were lined with closed doors, their paint peeling in long, curling strips. She reached for one door, pausing before twisting the handle. Inside was a sitting room filled with covered furniture. Dusty white sheets draped chairs, a couch, and a small table. The only uncovered object was a porcelain doll sitting upright on the mantel. Its once rosy cheeks were now cracked and faded, its glassy eyes staring forward with an intensity that made her uneasy. Another whisper sounded, louder this time, and Sarah spun toward the hall. She swung her flashlight wildly. Nothing. Only the hollow groans of the house settling around her. The whisper returned, closer, as if someone were just behind her, breathing against her neck. She whirled again, her heart hammering. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. The air seemed heavier, the walls closer. She felt like she was being watched, like 1,000 unseen eyes were fixed on her every move. She forced herself to take a steadying breath and focused on the sound of her boots on the floorboards, pushing away the whispers that now seemed to echo from every corner. But something was wrong. The hallway ahead looked different. The door she'd entered through was no longer visible, as if the house had shifted itself. She swore she had only taken a few steps past the sitting room, but now the hall stretched impossibly long, the light from her flashlight unable to reach the end. Sarah turned to look behind her, expecting to see the sitting room doorway, but the hall was empty in that direction as well. It was as if the house had swallowed the rooms she had passed through. Her chest tightened, her breathing quickened. She gripped her flashlight tighter and took a few steps forward. The whisper came again, clearer now, just ahead. It didn't sound like a single voice anymore. It sounded like many voices layered together, calling her name in a low, rhythmic chant. "Sarah, Sarah." The sound made her skin crawl. She wanted to turn around, to run, but her feet moved forward against her better judgment. The whispers grew louder with every step. As she moved deeper into the house, the air seemed to hum with a low vibration, and she had the unsettling feeling that she was not walking through the house at all. She was descending into something else entirely. The whispers seemed to vanish the moment Sarah stepped into the next room. For a moment she thought the house had quieted, that maybe she'd imagined the sounds. But then she saw the room's only prominent feature, a massive mirror dominating the far wall. It was out of place among the otherwise stark surroundings. The floorboards were warped, the ceiling sagging, but the mirror gleamed faintly in the light of her flashlight. Its frame was elaborate, almost gaudy, with curling vines and roses carved into the tarnished silver. The glass itself wasn't smooth. It was rippled and streaked, making her reflection appear hazy and warped. Sarah hesitated in the doorway, the beam of her flashlight dancing over the surface of the mirror. Her own image wavered, barely recognizable in the uneven glass. Something about it made her stomach turn. She stepped closer, cautiously, her boots creaking on the floorboards. With each step, her reflection grew clearer, more defined. But there was something off. Her eyes. In the mirror, her eyes seemed slightly wider, her pupils darker than they should have been. She blinked and felt her eyes close. Her reflection, however, did not blink. It stared back at her, unflinching. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She reached up to rub her own face, and the reflection mimicked her, but a fraction of a second too late, as though it were trying to keep up rather than following her movements naturally. She lowered her hand and stepped back, her flashlight shaking as unease began to spread through her body. She turned away, her heart pounding. Maybe it was just the uneven glass. Maybe the mirror was warped enough to create strange illusions. But before she could leave, her reflection moved again. She hadn't turned around, hadn't glanced back at the mirror, but she caught the movement from the corner of her eye. Her reflection tilted its head to one side. Slowly, intentionally, Sarah froze in place, her skin prickling. She forced herself to look back. The reflection was smiling. Her own face stared back at her with a grin she had not made. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was too wide, too forced, and it didn't reach her reflection's eyes. The figure tilted its head again, this time the other way, as if it were studying her. Sarah stepped back again, her legs unsteady, and the reflection didn't follow. It stayed there, frozen in its unsettling smile, watching her. "Hello," Sarah's voice wavered. The words sounded too loud, echoing off the empty walls. The reflection's grin widened further. Her stomach churned, and she took another step back. Then she noticed something else in the mirror, something moving behind her reflection. A shadow shifted along the edge of the glass, just outside the reflection's frame. It wasn't her shadow. The light from her flashlight wasn't angled that way. The shadow moved on its own, creeping closer to her reflected image. It reached toward her reflection, its long, dark fingers curling around the edges of the glass. Sarah turned abruptly, her flashlight cutting through the dim room. Nothing was behind her. The floor was empty, the walls bare. Her chest heaved as she tried to slow her breathing. When she turned back to the mirror, the shadow was gone, but her reflection was closer, pressing its hands against the glass as if it wanted to push through. The smile was gone, replaced with an expression of pure malice. Her reflection mouthed words she couldn't hear, but the meaning was clear. Don't leave. The room felt colder, the air seemed heavier. Sarah's legs finally unlocked, and she stumbled backward, not daring to take her eyes off the mirror. Her reflection slammed its palms against the glass, and for a brief moment she thought she heard a faint crack. She spun on her heel and bolted out of the room, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she ran. Behind her, the mirror's surface rippled like water. Something moved within, something that wasn't her reflection. The whisper started again, rising into a low, mocking laughter. Sarah didn't stop until she was back in the hallway, gasping for air. When she finally turned to look, the door to the mirrored room was closed tight. She didn't dare open it again. The laughter faded, leaving only the eerie, suffocating silence of the house. Sarah leaned against the hallway wall, her breath shallow and quick. Her flashlight beam jittered across the warped wallpaper as her shaking hands struggled to keep it steady. She glanced back at the closed door to the mirror room, half expecting it to open again, to unleash whatever had been lurking behind her reflection. But it remained shut. For now. The silence returned, oppressive and almost smothering. She couldn't tell if her ears were ringing from her own panicked breathing, or if the house itself thrummed with a faint, low hum. She took a step forward, toward what she thought was the staircase she'd come up earlier. But the hall seemed different now. The walls were closer together, the air even colder, and the faint smell of mildew was mixed with something sharper, something like rusted iron. She tightened her grip on her flashlight and moved forward, one hesitant step at a time. It was then that she heard it. A faint scratching noise, so soft at first she thought she might be imagining it. But as she stood still, holding her breath, the sound grew louder. It was coming from ahead, down the hall, from one of the closed doors. The scratching was irregular, sometimes frantic, sometimes slow and deliberate. It wasn't a single source, either. It was as if multiple sets of nails were dragging themselves across wood. Sarah shivered, her pulse thudding in her ears. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was worse, heavier. She didn't know if she wanted the noise to start again just so she could place it, or if she was desperate for it to vanish entirely. She stood frozen, staring down the hall. And then, just as she thought the house might let her leave without incident, the door at the end of the hallway creaked open. Her flashlight flickered as she pointed it toward the sound. The door wasn't fully open, just cracked enough to reveal the edge of a darkened room. She took a step back, every instinct screaming at her to turn and run. But her feet wouldn't move. Her curiosity, morbid and unrelenting, urged her forward. What was making that sound? What could possibly be scratching at the door? Her pulse thundered as she took one slow step, then another, toward the end of the hall. The door swung wider, revealing more darkness. The scratching resumed, louder now, more erratic. Sarah clenched her teeth. Every nerve in her body screamed that this was wrong, that she needed to turn back. But she reached out anyway, her fingers brushing the edge of the door. She gave it a gentle push, and it creaked inward. Her flashlight revealed a bedroom. The walls were lined with faded floral wallpaper, curling at the edges. The bed frame was wooden and splintered, the mattress long gone. A wardrobe stood against one wall, its door hanging open, but it was the floor that drew her attention. Deep, jagged grooves scored the wood in long, chaotic patterns. They were fresh. The edges of the scratches were sharp, as if made moments before. Sarah's mouth went dry. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The scratching stopped again. The stillness returned, pressing down on her chest. She scanned the room, moving her flashlight slowly. For a moment there was nothing, just the empty furniture, the gouged floor, and the damp chill. And then, in the far corner, she saw it. Something crouched there, its back to her, barely illuminated by the unsteady light. It was small, its frame hunched and unnatural. Its hands, or what should have been hands, were clawed, digging into the floorboards. The creature froze as her light passed over it. Slowly, impossibly slowly, it began to turn its head. Sarah couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The thing's face came into view, pale and grotesque, with hollow sockets where eyes should have been. A mouth stretched too wide, filled with teeth that looked more like splintered bone. It grinned. A low, guttural sound emerged from its throat, a rasping, rattling noise that made Sarah's knees weaken. She stumbled back, her flashlight dropping to her side. The creature started to move, crawling toward her with a jerking, uneven motion. Its claws scratched at the floor again, the sound piercing and horrible. Sarah turned and ran. She didn't look back. The sound of scratching followed her down the hallway, growing louder, more frantic. The house seemed to shift around her, the walls leaning in, the ceiling pressing down. She stumbled down the staircase, nearly falling, her flashlight bouncing wildly. The scratching was in her ears, in her skull. It was everywhere, and then suddenly it stopped. She found herself in the front hall again, standing at the base of the stairs. The door was still shut, the silence thick as ever. Her chest heaved as she gasped for air, her mind racing. For a moment, she wondered if she'd imagined it all, if the house was playing tricks on her. She took one step toward the front door, and her heart stopped. It was open. The heavy oak door she'd been certain was locked now stood ajar, a sliver of moonlight spilling inside. But as she moved closer, she realized the scratching hadn't stopped after all. It was just quieter now, softer. It was coming from the other side of the door. Something was waiting for her outside. Sarah froze at the threshold of the nursery. It was the first door she came across after the scratching had stopped, a narrow wooden thing that felt more oppressive than a simple door should. Her flashlight trembled in her grip as she slowly nudged it open. The hinges gave a quiet, plaintive creak, as if the room itself were sighing in resignation. The air inside was colder than the rest of the house, and it carried a faint, musty sweetness, like long-forgotten perfume. As the door swung wider, her flashlight beam illuminated the faded remnants of what had once been a child's room. The wallpaper, which must have been bright and cheerful decades ago, now hung in curling strips, its lambs and clouds cracked and ghostly. A tiny bed sat in the corner, its once bright coverlet now gray with age and dust. A dollhouse rested on a low table, its front panel hanging askew, revealing furniture and miniature figures toppled as if they'd been abandoned mid-game. In the far corner, a rocking horse stood still, its paint faded and its mane long gone. Its eyes, black beads that glinted faintly in the light, seemed to follow Sarah as she stepped inside. The floor creaked under her weight, and she stopped just a few steps in, feeling a prickling sensation run up the back of her neck. The air grew heavier with each breath, her skin crawling as though something unseen was studying her every move. She tried to focus on the ordinary, the cracked mobile hanging over the crib, the scattered blocks on the floor, the dust motes swirling in her flashlight's beam. It had all the markings of a place meant to nurture, to comfort, but everything felt wrong. The lambs on the wallpaper looked more like twisted figures the longer she stared, their painted eyes now sharp and predatory. The rocking horse seemed to lean slightly toward her. Then the sound came, a faint giggle, soft and sharp, like the tinkling of a broken wind-up music box. Sarah spun around, her flashlight darting wildly across the room. It seemed to come from the toy box in the corner, its lid slightly ajar. She hesitated, every nerve screaming at her to run, but she couldn't look away. The giggle came again, a little louder this time, sending an icy chill down her spine. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring of her heartbeat in her ears. The room gave no answer, no words, at least. But the rocking horse began to sway. It rocked slowly at first, then faster, its hooves tapping against the floor. The creaking grew louder, filling the small room, drowning out everything else. Sarah's hands trembled so badly that her flashlight beam shook like a strobe light, casting the rocking horse into disjointed, jerky motions. The giggle returned, louder now, and it was no longer alone. A second laugh joined it, then another. It sounded like children's laughter, but distorted, rising and falling like waves of static. The toy box lid creaked open wider. Sarah stepped back, bumping into the edge of the crib. The mobile above her began to spin on its own, the faded lambs and stars whirling faster and faster. "Stay with us," a voice whispered, high and childish. Sarah gasped, her breath catching in her throat. The blocks on the floor began to shift, sliding across the wood as if pulled by invisible strings. They aligned themselves into crude shapes, a word. "Stay." Her flashlight flickered, and for a moment the room plunged into darkness. When the beam returned, the room looked the same, but something had changed. The dollhouse figures, once scattered and face down, now stood upright, turned toward her. Their tiny painted faces stared at her, their frozen smiles wide and unnatural. The rocking horse stopped suddenly, the sound of its movement replaced by a suffocating silence. Sarah couldn't move, she couldn't breathe. The whispers came again, surrounding her, overlapping and growing louder. "Stay, stay, stay with us." She bolted. She turned and fled the nursery, slamming the door behind her. The voices faded, the giggles silenced. But as she leaned against the door, trying to catch her breath, she realized the silence wasn't normal. It was heavy, waiting, as if the house itself was holding its breath. It wasn't over, not even close. Sarah pressed her back against the nursery door, her breath coming fast and shallow. The corridor in front of her was still dark, still oppressively silent, but it offered the tiniest glimmer of relief after what she'd just experienced. Her flashlight wavered in her unsteady grip, casting nervous beams across the warped walls and peeling wallpaper. She pushed herself off the door, trying to quiet her mind, and stepped cautiously forward. If she could just find her way back to the front door, if she could make it out of this suffocating labyrinth, everything would be okay. She repeated that in her head like a mantra. Her footsteps seemed to echo, though the house had a way of making sounds travel strangely. The door at the far end of the hallway caught her eye. It wasn't like the others. This one was slightly ajar, showing a sliver of a dimly lit room. The light seemed unnatural, faintly bluish, and it pulsed gently as though the air inside was alive. Sarah hesitated. Every rational thought told her not to go near that door, not after what she'd just experienced. But curiosity, combined with the strange magnetic pull of the light, tugged her forward. As she got closer, she saw the faint outline of lettering carved into the door's frame. The words were faded, scratched deeply into the wood, and mostly illegible. All Sarah could make out was a single word, mine. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door. She told herself she just wanted to look inside, to see what was casting that strange light. Nothing more, just one quick glance, and then she'd turn back. The moment she touched the door, It creaked open. The air in the room was icy, colder even than the nursery, and she saw her breath puff out in short clouds. She stepped inside, her flashlight beam barely making an impression against the dark corners of the room. The source of the light was a small lamp on a desk at the far end, flickering weakly. The desk itself was covered in papers, dozens of them, yellowed and curling at the edges. The walls were lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of rotting books. The smell of mildew and old paper hit her immediately, mixed with something metallic. She stepped closer to the desk, scanning the pages. They were covered in writing, but not the kind she could read. It looked like a child's scribbles, swirling, looping lines and jagged scratches. Some of the symbols repeated over and over, burned into the paper so deeply that they left holes. She reached out, her fingers brushing one of the pages. The paper felt unnaturally rough, almost sharp, as though the symbols themselves were raised. The moment she touched it, she felt a chill travel through her body. She snatched her hand back. She glanced around the room again, her flashlight catching on something just beside the desk. It was a large, heavy ledger bound in thick, cracked leather. A faint memory stirred in her mind. She had seen something like this in old photographs. Bellamy family records, maybe? She hesitated before pulling it closer. The cover was blank, but when she opened it, she saw names listed down the pages. Most were names she didn't recognize, followed by dates she didn't care to decipher. But as she flipped further, the names grew more familiar. People from the village, names she had heard whispered in passing. And then she froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her own name was there. Sarah Walker, written in the same jagged, almost childlike scrawl that covered the loose papers. Beside her name was today's date. Her fingers ran over the ink, her heart pounding in her chest. It was impossible. No one knew she was here. No one knew she'd come to Bellamy Manor. As she stared at the page, the flickering lamp dimmed further, and the room seemed to draw inward. The shelves looked closer than they had been moments ago. A shadow moved across the far wall, just at the edge of her vision. She swung her flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe. She closed the ledger, her hands shaking. Behind her, the door slammed shut. The sound was deafening, reverberating through the room like a gunshot. She spun around, the flashlight jerking in her hand. The door was closed tight, the handle unmoving when she tried it. Her chest heaved and her flashlight flickered again. She turned back toward the desk, hoping for some clue, some explanation, but the room had changed. The papers were gone, the books on the shelves now just faint outlines in the dark. The lamp was out entirely, and the only light came from her flashlight's fading beam. A sound broke the silence, a long, deep breath coming from the far corner of the room. She turned the light toward it, her hands trembling. There was nothing at first, just a mass of shadow. Then the shadows shifted, and a shape emerged, a figure crouching low, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. Its eyes glinted faintly, reflecting the weak beam of her flashlight. It didn't move, but its breathing grew louder, ragged and guttural. Sarah backed away, her hand fumbling at the door. It wouldn't budge. The figure rose slowly, its movements jerky, like a puppet pulled by unseen strings. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs seemed to stretch longer with every second. The breath came again, raspy and wet. Sarah banged on the door, her voice cracking as she shouted for help. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, its hollow eyes locked onto her. She screamed as the room plunged into darkness. Sarah's scream echoed through the blackness, swallowed up by the oppressive silence that followed. Her flashlight was dead now, no comforting beam to cut through the pitch dark. She fumbled with it, slapping the casing and twisting the handle, but nothing worked. The room felt smaller than it had moments before, the air thicker, pressing against her like a damp, heavy shroud. She stumbled back until her hand brushed the wall behind her. The surface was cool, almost damp, and seemed to tremble under her palm. Somewhere in the shadows, that rattling breath still sounded, closer now. Suddenly, there was movement, a faint shuffle, the creak of wood. Sarah froze, her every nerve screaming for her to run. But where would she go? Her fingers slid along the wall, searching desperately for a doorframe or a latch. As her eyes adjusted, she thought she saw the faintest glimmer of light in the distance, just a pinprick, but enough to pull her attention. Her heart pounding, she edged toward it. The soft glow flickered faintly, unevenly, like a candle struggling against a draft. As she moved closer, she realized it wasn't coming from the room at all, but from a staircase leading down. The cellar. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and stopped at the top of the steps. The light seemed to beckon her, growing brighter, as if inviting her down into the depths. The air grew colder, carrying a scent that made her stomach churn, earthy, wet, and metallic, like rusted iron and decaying wood. She didn't want to go. Every instinct told her to stay where she was, to find another way out. But there was no other way. The walls behind her seemed to close in, and the oppressive silence was now punctuated by that faint scratching sound again. Her options were to face whatever was upstairs, or descend into the unknown. With shaking hands, she gripped the railing, its wooden surface splintered and damp. The first step groaned under her weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. She winced, waiting for something, anything, to respond. When nothing did, she took another step, then another. Each creak seemed to echo, as if the house were announcing her descent. The light grew brighter with every step, though the stairs themselves seemed to stretch endlessly downward. It didn't make sense. She should have reached the cellar floor by now. Instead, the walls seemed to stretch farther apart, the temperature dropping further. Her breath came out in visible clouds, and she felt her fingertips going numb. At last, her boots touched solid ground. The light was coming from a lantern resting on a table in the center of the room, its flame low and flickering. The cellar was vast, far larger than the house above. The ceiling arched high, the beams sagging under the weight of time. Rows of shelves lined the walls, their contents hidden under layers of dust and cobwebs. Old crates and barrels sat haphazardly around the room, their lids broken or missing, revealing dark, empty interiors. She stepped toward the lantern, drawn to its faint, golden glow. When she reached the table, she hesitated. Beside the lantern lay a collection of objects, a pair of shears, rusted and stained, a small, cracked mirror, and a book bound in what looked like aged leather. The book's cover was blank, the material worn smooth in places. It radiated a faint, unpleasant warmth, as if it were alive. Sarah reached out, her fingers hovering just above the surface. She knew she shouldn't touch it. She knew nothing good could come from opening that book. But her hand lowered slowly, as though something unseen were pulling it down. The moment her fingers brushed the cover, the lantern flame flickered violently, almost extinguishing. She gasped and jerked her hand away, but it was too late. The air in the cellar shifted, the chill deepening to an icy bite. The scratching sound began again, louder, closer. It was coming from the walls this time, or no, from the crates, from everywhere. It surrounded her, filling the space with a grating, relentless noise. The lantern went out. Sarah spun around, her heart racing as she clutched at the table. She couldn't see a thing. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. She stumbled back toward the staircase, her hands stretched out in front of her. But where the stairs should have been, there was nothing. Just empty air. She turned back toward the table, the objects now completely invisible in the blackness. A new sound joined the scratching, the faintest whisper, low and guttural. It was speaking words she couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, commanding. Sarah's knees buckled, and she dropped to the ground, covering her ears. The whispering grew louder, surrounding her, echoing through the cavernous cellar. She felt the floor shift beneath her palms, as if something was crawling just beneath the surface. And then all at once it stopped. The scratching, the whispers, everything fell silent. Sarah stayed where she was, frozen in place. The air was so still it felt heavy. She dared not move, her heart hammering so loudly she thought it might echo off the walls. In the silence, a faint breath brushed past her ear, cold and rasping. She screamed and scrambled to her feet, her hands groping through the blackness until they found the staircase. The steps creaked and groaned as she bolted upward. She didn't stop until she reached the top, bursting back into the hallway. The door at the top slammed shut behind her, but she didn't look back. She ran blindly down the corridor, not knowing where she was going, only that she had to get as far from the cellar as possible. The sound of her own frantic breathing filled her ears, drowning out the silence of the house as she plunged deeper into its shadowed halls. Sarah stumbled forward, desperate to put as much distance as possible between herself and the cellar door. The hallway seemed to twist and lengthen as she ran, the floorboards uneven underfoot. She gripped her dead flashlight in one hand, holding it like a talisman, and fought the urge to look behind her. She wasn't sure what she'd see, but she was certain she didn't want to know. The silence had returned, an awful, suffocating stillness that made her ears strain for any hint of noise. Her heart hammered as she tried to orient herself. The layout of the house made no sense. What should have been the main corridor leading back toward the entrance now stretched endlessly. Doors lined the walls, each shut tight, some padlocked, others barely hanging on their hinges. The air was thick, damp, and metallic, and she had the feeling she was being funneled somewhere. She paused for a moment to catch her breath. The hall stretched on both sides, indistinguishable, its ends disappearing into darkness. Ahead, one door stood ajar, faint light spilling through the crack. Her breath caught. She knew she shouldn't go inside, but it was the only visible landmark, the only sign of anything that wasn't endless corridor. With nowhere else to turn, she approached it. The room beyond the door was circular and far larger than it should have been. It reminded her of an old stone chapel, though the walls were bare and stained with dark streaks. Symbols were etched into the floor in a chaotic, sprawling pattern, their lines jagged and uneven. Sarah's stomach churned as she stepped into the room. The faint light came from a series of candles arranged in a ring around the edge of the space. The flames flickered without any apparent draft, their glow casting long, writhing shadows that seemed alive. In the center of the circle was a low, rough altar made of blackened wood. On it lay an open book, bound in what looked disturbingly like stretched leather. Beside the book were objects she didn't want to examine too closely, something gleaming and metallic, something wrapped in a crimson-stained cloth. The air was colder here, and it carried a strange hum that she felt more than heard. The symbols on the floor seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. Sarah hesitated at the threshold, every fiber of her being urging her to turn back. Yet her feet moved forward. She tried to resist, but her body felt distant, like a puppet being dragged toward the altar. Her legs trembled as she crossed the threshold into the circle of candles. The air was heavy here, pressing down on her shoulders, and the humming grew louder with every step. When she reached the altar, she couldn't help but glance at the open book. Its pages were filled with the same jagged, looping symbols she'd seen on the papers in the study. Only now, they seemed to shift and writhe on the page. She tried to tear her gaze away, but her eyes refused to look elsewhere. Words began to form, written in crimson, appearing letter by letter, as if an invisible hand was carving them into the parchment. "You are chosen, Sarah. You must complete the rite." Her breath hitched. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, I didn't choose this." The candles flared brighter, their flames turning an unnatural green. The hum turned into a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the stones beneath her feet. The symbols on the floor pulsed faster, brighter, and she felt an awful pull, like hands grabbing at her chest, her arms, her very being. "Leave me alone," she pleaded, backing away from the altar. But she couldn't step outside the circle. The invisible force holding her there was too strong. The symbols flared one last time, then faded to nothing. The candles snuffed out simultaneously, plunging the room into darkness. In the silence, she heard a faint voice. It wasn't a whisper. It was clear, low, and resonant. "It is too late." A violent wind surged through the room, pushing Sarah to her knees. The floor beneath her shifted, and she felt the unmistakable sensation of something moving just below the surface. Something vast, something alive. She clawed at the floor, desperate to get away, but there was no escape. The voice came again, louder this time, echoing in her mind. "The rite has begun." Suddenly the walls seemed to fold inward, the space around her warping. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw was the altar, now empty, before the room collapsed into blackness. Sarah's breath hitched as she was thrust back into the hallway. The air was heavy, as though it was pressing against her chest. She scrambled to her feet, looking around in confusion. The altar, the book, the chanting voices, all gone. But the house wasn't the same. Something had changed. The walls no longer felt like mere walls. They seemed alive, pulsing faintly, the faded wallpaper rippling like flesh. The floors creaked underfoot, not just from her steps, but in random intervals, as though the house was adjusting itself, shifting its weight. Shadows flickered and danced along the walls without any light source. Her flashlight still wouldn't turn on, and she dropped it to the floor. It clattered, the sound too loud in the oppressive silence. Her pulse thundered in her ears, and her thoughts spiraled. Had she lost track of time? Was the house playing tricks on her mind? Or was it something worse, something she didn't want to name? Then she heard it. A low, guttural groan echoed through the hall. Not a human sound, not something mechanical. It was deep and wet, like the sound of old wood bending under tremendous pressure. Sarah stumbled back a step, the floor beneath her feet feeling more like soft, damp soil than wood. The hallway in front of her began to stretch, twisting at angles that didn't make sense. The corners of the ceiling dipped and shifted as though the house were trying to fold in on itself. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to move. She had to get out. Every door she tried was locked, the handles cold and slick beneath her fingers. Her footsteps sounded louder than they should have, each one echoing as if the house was amplifying her every movement. She could feel it now. The house wasn't just changing, it was aware. It was reacting to her presence, growing more animate with every step she took. The air was thick and damp, heavy with the smell of rot and earth. Ahead, the hallway split into two paths. One veered left, leading into a darker corridor, while the other stretched out in front of her, the flickering light of a single rusted chandelier illuminating a crooked staircase. Sarah hesitated, her throat dry and her palms slick with sweat. That groaning noise came again, this time closer. The walls seemed to tremble, their pulsating surface shifting toward her like lungs inhaling deeply. She chose the staircase, racing up the warped steps as quickly as her shaking legs would allow. Each step felt like it might collapse under her weight, but she didn't stop. The groaning grew louder behind her, and now there were other sounds, scratching, tapping, whispers just on the edge of hearing. She reached the landing, only to find another corridor stretching out before her, its end disappearing into darkness. Her body felt heavy. Her muscles screamed at her to stop, to rest, but she knew she couldn't. Not with that sound behind her. Not with the house growing more alive by the second. The floor beneath her trembled, and she could swear she felt something shift under the surface, as if there were things crawling just beneath the floorboards. She ran, every instinct urging her forward, and then she saw it, a door. Different from the others, this one was wide open, revealing a room bathed in faint, cold light. The flickering glow was unnatural, almost bluish. Sarah paused, gasping for breath, as her eyes adjusted. The room inside was vast, far larger than it could have been, given the size of the house. Its ceiling arched impossibly high, supported by warped beams that twisted like tree roots. The floor was bare stone, covered in faint markings that glowed faintly as she stepped inside. The groaning stopped, the walls ceased their trembling, and the heavy air seemed to lighten slightly. Sarah stood frozen in the center of the room, turning in slow circles. The markings on the floor were the same jagged symbols she'd seen before, but here they seemed to form a larger, more intricate pattern. At the far end of the room, a shape emerged from the shadows. At first, she thought it was another piece of warped furniture or an oddly shaped column, but as the light shifted, it became clear. It wasn't furniture. It was something that didn't belong in this world, an amorphous, writhing form that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It had no clear shape, no eyes, no mouth, but it moved as though it were watching her. The glowing symbols flared brighter as it shifted, sliding forward with an unsettling fluidity. Sarah's body locked up, her feet refusing to obey as the thing came closer. The air grew colder again, and the whispers returned, louder now, overlapping in a cacophony that made her ears ring. "Run," the voice in her mind said, but she couldn't. She was rooted to the spot, staring at the impossible shape as it loomed over her. It paused, as if studying her, the glowing lines on the floor pulsing in rhythm with its movements. Sarah's breathing was shallow, her vision narrowing as the thing reached out, not with arms, but with the suggestion of limbs, curling shadows that stretched toward her. A single word echoed in the room, low and resonant, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Mine. Her scream tore through the silence as the world around her twisted, the walls collapsing inward and the glowing lines swallowing her whole. The moment Sarah's scream faded, the room seemed to collapse in on itself. The glowing lines pulsed violently, and then the ground beneath her feet gave way. She fell not through empty air, but through something thick and clinging, as though the house itself was swallowing her whole. The walls closed around her, dark and wet, pressing against her from every side. The air grew colder still, burning her lungs with each gasp, and then suddenly she was back on solid ground. She opened her eyes to find herself standing in the front hall of Bellamy Manor. The massive door loomed before her, just as it had when she first entered. For a moment she thought she was free. She stumbled forward, her fingers brushing the cold brass handle. It turned easily, and the door creaked open. Outside was nothing but darkness. No trees, no path back to the village, just an endless black void that stretched on forever. The faint silhouette of the house's front gate floated impossibly far away, unreachable. Sarah stepped back, her breath hitching. She turned around, hoping to find another exit, but the hall behind her had changed. The walls were closer now, the space more like a tunnel than a room. The wallpaper, once just faded and peeling, now writhed as if alive. Shadows crawled across the surfaces, though no light remained. She tried to remember how she had come in, which doors she had passed, but everything was different. Doors led to nowhere, hallways looped back on themselves. The house had become a maze with no logic, no pattern. Her footsteps echoed as she moved, the sound no longer matching the rhythm of her steps. Each time she turned a corner, the whispers returned, quiet at first, but growing louder with every step. They called her name now, clearly, insistently. "Sarah, Sarah, stay with us." She broke into a run, but no matter how far or fast she went, the hallways stretched endlessly ahead of her. The house was alive. It wasn't just shifting or creaking, it was breathing, watching, waiting. Sarah tried every door she passed, but they were either locked, bricked over, or simply led her back to where she started. Her mind raced, desperate for a way out. She dropped the flashlight, useless in the complete dark. The only light came from the walls themselves now, faint and pulsing, as if the house's very veins carried a dim, flickering glow. As she ran, she heard it again, the low, guttural groan. The house was waking up. The whispers turned to laughter, mocking and cruel. Shadows moved ahead of her, closing off passages she thought she'd already come down. The very floor beneath her feet rippled and shifted, forcing her down new corridors that seemed to appear from nowhere. She was being funneled again, drawn towards something waiting for her. She reached a final door, different from the rest. It was old, ancient, its surface etched with the same jagged symbols she'd seen in the ritual room. It swung open without a sound, revealing a cavernous space beyond. The room was empty except for a single object in the center, a large mirror. Sarah froze in the doorway, her chest heaving, her breath visible in the frigid air. She recognized the mirror. It was the same one she had seen before, but now it was flawless, its glass smooth and clear, reflecting her perfectly. But as she took a step closer, her reflection didn't move. The Sarah in the mirror stood still, staring back with wide eyes. The longer she looked, the more she realized it wasn't just standing still. It was watching her, studying her. Its expression was wrong. The mouth was too tight, the eyes too hollow. Sarah backed away, but her reflection didn't retreat. It stepped closer to the surface of the mirror, its hands pressing against the glass as if it wanted to push through. "No," Sarah whispered. "This isn't real." The reflection smiled. Its lips moved, but the words didn't match her own. They came from the house, from the walls, from everywhere. "You belong to us now." The room began to tremble. The mirror rippled like water, and the reflection pressed harder, its distorted features stretching as though it was about to break free. Sarah turned to run, but the door had vanished. The walls closed in, the ceiling lowered. She screamed again, her voice lost in the cacophony of laughter and whispers. The last thing she saw was her reflection stepping through the glass, its arms outstretched. The house exhaled one final heavy breath, and the darkness swallowed her whole.